Wagwan, everybody. Welcome to the Dissect History podcast, where we'll be speaking about history and as well family history and how history relates in terms of Caribbean people for the present as well as in the past, and how in the past what that does and brings forth for what we are going through at present and what we can learn from our history, from our family, and take that moving forward. So I do hope you enjoy the podcast. And if you like it, please ensure to subscribe, like, and review. Thank you.
In this episode, Wendy Aris will be joined with Adélaïde Marine-Gougeon, who is currently writing her doctoral thesis, Circulations, Réseaux et Identité des familles blanches créoles de la Martinique au XIXe siècle, entre transcolonialisme et nationalisme. Circulations, networks, and white Creole family identity in Martinique in the 18th century between transcolonialism and nationalism. 19th century, transcolonialism and nationalism under the supervision of Jacques-Olivier Boudon, Sorbonne University, 20th Century History Center, and Miriam Cotius, CNRS, CIRESC. She is also an RTR, Teaching and Research Fellow in Contemporary History at Sorbonne University's School of the Humanities. We will be discussing racial mixing and racial boundaries in 19th century Martinique. So let's have a listen.
Well, I just want to thank you, Adélaïde, for coming on to the podcast, Dissect History, to talk about your article, which I thought was quite interesting from this perspective. From Martinique is racial mixing and racial boundaries in the 19th century in Martinique. So before we start, can I just have you just do a brief introduction of yourself?
Yes. So my name is Adélaïde Marine-Gougeon. I'm PhD student, researcher. So I'm working on white Creole families in Martinique in the 19th century. And I chose this subject because the white minority is not very much studied for itself. And there are, of course, many studies about slavery, colonization in the French West Indies, but there was no work made on this specific minority. So that's why I chose to study it. And it led me to the history of those families.
Oh, perfect. No, thank you. Thank you so much for that. Because again, these are narratives that are not really told that much other than from a very negative context, right? So,
yeah.
So what were some of the key and social and political dynamics influencing the racial mixing in 19th century Martinique?
I would say, of course, the main dynamic is the persistence of slavery during the first half of the 19th century. The influence is that the domination of enslaved women and free women of color is the main fact. I've read a lot of works about demographic history. I don't know if it's the right word, but the study of past population in slavery societies. And the historian states that free people of color, men and women, were not really attracted to marriage. Marriage was an institution that meant a form of respectability, and it was also linked with the transmission of estates, of properties. And many free people of color preferred staying outside of marriage, but maybe we can talk about this throughout the conversation.
Yes,
and for free women of color, the interest could be interesting to have relationships with white men from metropole or white Creole because they can provide them financial services or gifts or things like that. But as for white Creole men and enslaved women, we can allege that mostly it's very domination relationships and rape mostly. But also we can't really exclude the fact that maybe it was also a pathway to freedom for the children born out of these relationships. So it's really difficult to know, but the main thing is those are constraints and those are really under the domination of slavery and racism. And those structures did not fundamentally change after emancipation because marriage was still not the norm for people of African descent and people who were free before 1848, which was the year when slavery was abolished in Martinique and Guadeloupe and in the whole French colonial empire. And of course, people who were freed in 1848, it was also the same.
Yes. Yeah, no, definitely. We'll get to some of those as well, because that is a huge power struggle as well. And would you be able to explain, I guess, the racial categories that were defined to maintain in Martinique's colonial society?
Okay, I will try. I will start with the definition of whiteness, because which of course is what I study with my families. But I started with that because whiteness is not a matter of color, or not only of color. As you may know, during the 18th century, historians show that people with mixed ancestry managed to be recognized as white in order to enjoy all the civil rights and to avoid discrimination. So you could be mixed race, descent, and to be recognized as white. So it was, of course, it depended on your color, skin color, but you could also hide your ancestry in order to pass as white. And some individuals could manage to pass as white in the 18th century, but the historians show that the more you go through the 18th century, less that situation was possible. And maybe I should start by recalling that many colonists in the beginning of the colonization married or had children with Amerindian women or enslaved African women. So many of white Creoles probably have Amerindian or African ancestors, but they hid it in their genealogies. In the late 18th century, because everything that happens in the 19th depends on what happened in the 18th. The white Creole from Martinique called Moreau de Saint-Méry, he created a great deal of racial categories to separate people who are supposed to be white and people who have quarters of black blood. And he traces a line that separates white people from all mixed blood individuals, even if they look like whites, because his main fear is to be not to be able to recognize those who are from well-established white families and those who look like white but have mixed ancestry and consequently slave origins. And the problem is that after the abolition, that conception remains, because one of those categories is called the mulattoes, les mulâtres en français. So I will come back to that, but mulattoes are a very vague category that gathers people from all skin colors, but they had the ambition to challenge the white Creole in a social position. Indeed, some of them managed to study, have success in business, but failed to have access to political positions, such as mayors, local representatives. And after the emancipation, those mulattoes emerged as the main threats for white Creole, and much more than the newly freed people.
No, definitely. It definitely is a power struggle. So would you say that there were, I guess, legal distinctions between free people of color and enslaved and white colonists in Martinique?
Yes, of course. During slavery, there were racial categories based on legal status, of course. You were a slave, which was a legal distinction, or free. But inside the free people, there were discriminations inside those groups, or you were white. And if you were white, it meant that all your ancestors were supposed to be from Europe, and you were a descendant of colonists from Europe. And it means that your ancestors always were free. But if you had slave ancestors, you were in a different category of free people, and you were categorized as free people of color. And after the abolition, of course, the distinction between free people vanishes. There is no free people of color. That doesn't exist anymore. But the new category called mulattoes, as I mentioned before, appears. And the word existed before, but it has now a new meaning. And maybe I should precise something about the Republican regime. Because when the slavery was abolished in Martinique, it was the Second Republic from 1848 to 1851, 1848 to 1851. And the Republican ideology was based on equality between citizens. And so it made it impossible to recognize a formal naturalization of inequality. I don't know if it's clear.
No, it's clear, yeah. Yeah, that
Okay.
makes a difference. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Yeah, the Second and then the Third Republic that began in 1870, the Second and then the Third Republic created the illusion of a perfect equality between all citizens. Inside Martinique and Guadeloupe, which were colonies. So it created a huge dissonance between political discourses and the reality, because racism was a reality. And I should add that at the same time the Second Republic abolished slavery, the main abolitionist who is called Victor Schœlcher, made former enslaved citizens. So they were allowed to vote. And it was a plain application of suffrage universel, universal suffrage. And it was removed during the Second Empire and then re-established in 1870 during the Third Republic. So Republican regime is based on the illusion that race doesn't exist, so no difference between all free people, and that all citizens are equal despite the colonial ground or the reality of social relations. So during the slavery era, of course, there were legal distinctions, but after 1848, no distinction in theory.
In theory. So before we, in what ways did, I guess, racial mixing challenge or reinforce the social hierarchies in Martinique? I know you mentioned a few things here, but if you can elaborate a little bit more.
Sure. As I said just before, there is a strong illusion in France, even today, that racial mixing can contribute to eliminate racism. Maybe I think you had a couple of episodes about Brazil. And as you may know, there is a very structured ideology in Brazil based on métissage, on racial mixing. There is no such thing in France or in French West Indies. However, the idea is still present. As I said just before, in 1848, the official Republican ideology is the fusion of the races, la fusion des races. It means that it is based on the idea that all the races can now live together, now that everyone is free, and that everyone can work together to build a new colonial society purified from slavery. And as I write on the article we read, Schœlcher, the abolitionist, thought racism would disappear. And it would be allowed by the racial fusion, the mixing of all races. But at the same time, the contrary occurred. It was more and more important to revive the racial boundary to allow the white minority to maintain its dominant status. So in the same time, racial mixing never disappeared because it was closely tied to how society functioned. And first of all, the society was based on the domination of white men, especially white Creole men, and they were allowed to have relationships, or sexual or even marital, with colored women, as long as they kept it outside of marriage. So what I found was the most serious transgression was interracial marriage, not interracial relationships is okay, but interracial marriage was not okay at all. It was very rare, but it existed. And if a white man crossed that line, he was excluded from his family and especially from his right to inheritance. And that social rules still prevails nowadays inside the white Creole minority. So in that extent, interracial relationships reinforces social hierarchies because it maintains colored women in a state of inferiority if it excludes them from the right to inherit from their companions and to give estates to their children. So maybe to nuance a little bit, as you know, in France, there is a Code Civil, the Code Napoleon, the legal code that maintains married women as everlasting minors and gives all the rights to the husbands. So staying out of marriage allows some autonomy. I will come back to that later, and maintains also unmarried women outside of the law and the rights of succession.
And this goes to my next question, because in terms of the inheritance laws, like how did interracial relationships impact the structures of these laws?
As I said before, the main distinction between white population and colored population is the behavior. I studied carefully the civil status of white Creole families I worked on. I reconstitute genealogies, and I paid very careful attention to the civil status. And in Martinique, during the 19th century, a person is recognized as white if one is recognized as a member of a white family from a legally married couple only. So whiteness is above all a mutual recognition from members of the group of families recognized as whites. So this is why family names are very helpful, but it can also be very tricky. I would like to give you examples, very striking examples. At several occasions, I saw people from a white family who did not marry people from white family, but who seemed to have slightly different social trajectory and married other people of color. And yet they bear a family name recognized as white. So I couldn't understand what happened. Yeah. And then I discovered the plot twist, because those situations happened when a white man, Creole, recognized children they had from an interracial union with a colored woman. Mm-hmm. So I suppose the woman to be colored thanks to several clues. Or she doesn't bear patronymic name, which was a clear sign of slave origins in the French context. Mm-hmm. Or she is herself from illegitimate birth, which is a clue that makes me say that you cannot be white. Or because of her profession. For example, if you are a seamstress, for example. Mm. So that are clues that make me think that the woman the white man had children with was not white, because they did not marry her, but he still recognized the children. And at those occasions, white family name passed on to colored individuals and so families. And this is why it is necessary to examine carefully civil status and matrimony of the individuals, because the recognition of such children wasn't usual, but it's not that rare either. Mm-hmm. It allowed the father to give a part of the heritage to his natural children, including his name, and a part of the symbolic capital captured by the patronymic name. And indeed, those children were afterwards able to marry, and the status allowed them to have interesting social perspective. Yeah. So the recognition of the father helps to overcome a little bit the shame of being born illegitimate.
Yes, that was just another stigma as well in terms of with African ancestry, not only in Martinique, but in other islands as well. Could you as well be able to speak a little to, I guess, how individuals of mixed ancestry navigated, of course, racial identity and social status? I know you mentioned some of it in the previous answer, and of course, their social status.
Oh, yeah. It's difficult to answer because there could be many different strategies. From what I observed, some try to obtain legal recognition in order to get married and have such social legitimacy, as I mentioned just before. But others migrated to the metropole in order to escape colonial society, and maybe for some of them try to pass as white. Some of my colleagues show that it could be possible in metropole to avoid racial discrimination if you could pass as white. That was possible. And others involved in political struggles and took on a confrontation with the white minority. Others tried to manage with the situation and carried on their business, especially women. Of course, women were not involved in political careers, but they were, of course, in political and social struggles, of course, but they did not had the ambition to have political careers, of course. But women tried to carry on their business. And some of them, mostly men, tried many of those options. So the gender, the social position, if you had done studies or not, all of this determined the strategies one could develop. If I have time, I would like to develop an example of a man called Cyril Bisset, which is a very interesting example. Bisset is the first abolitionist. He was during the 19th century. He was a free man of color, and he was condemned for writing or spreading a petition denouncing the discrimination of free people of color in Martinique. He was arrested, condemned, and deported to France in the 1820. And then he became abolitionist, although he was a slave owner in Martinique before that. But in 1848, for some reasons, he was marginalized by Schellcher, the French abolitionist that is mainly known, and he was cast out of the Commission of Abolition. So he did not take part of the work of the reduction of the law that abolished slavery in France. And then he came closer to the white Creole minority and made an alliance with them. But with the same people who condemned him more than 20 years ago. So he helped them preserve their political power in the name of the fusion of the races and of the forgetfulness of the past. It was the same man. So that was a strategy amongst others. And I would like also to pay tribute to the work of several of my colleagues, historian colleagues, including Jessica Balgui. She works on free people of color who were slave owners, and she stated that free women of color were important slave owners, or because they were plantation owners themselves, or because they used a slave and they rent slaves to make a living in the colonial society where slavery was everything. So, it makes things very complex, and there is not one strategy or one behavior. So, yeah. And maybe just for the case of free women of color, some of them enjoyed real form of social and economic independence as planter or shopkeepers or artisans or even business women. And such an independence was barely imaginable for married white Creole women. And this is also a reason why they were not interested with marriage. It's because those women wanted to keep their economic independence.
No, definitely. It afforded them a different type of life and a different type of, I guess, power as well that they had within themselves. So just very fascinating to look back at this time. And how would you say, in terms of the religious institutions, did they influence the perceptions of race and racial boundaries in Martinique during this time?
It's difficult to say, because I did not study that point in detail. All I can say about religion and the influence of religious institutions is that clergy condemned the, I quote, debauchery, how do you pronounce that? Debauchery of white Creole men, because they had the habits to have mistresses of color in town. They had the habits of having family of color outside marriage. Most of the time, they did that before getting married with white Creole women. And the church, the clergymen, hated that attitude that behavior, because they thought white Creole men should give the example of marriage, etc. And most of them did both, had one family in town or before getting married, and have also many different mistresses or relationships outside of marriage. And it was common. They had a sort of sexual freedom, and they were not criticized by the society, by other men, but they were criticized by the church. And of course, the church condemned the same for colored women because they were not interested with marriage. So it led to a whole condemnation of those, how could I say, liberty, freedom of,
No, that's no. Thank you for that, because that's a common theme in many of the islands, no matter who the colonial power was. That is definitely a common theme. And were there any influences from revolutionary Haiti or other colonial societies on Martinique's racial dynamics?
The influences from Haiti, of course, yes. Haiti reflected the main fear of all the white population during the whole 19th century. And even at the end of the 19th century, no one forgot what happened in Haiti. So, of course, it's very interesting, very important. A historian wrote a book about that called, his name is Alejandro Gomez, and he wrote a whole book about the influence of Haiti in the whole Caribbean Atlantic space in the 19th century. So what I will say is just based on what I saw and of course what he already wrote. He wrote that, of course, what I can see also in my work is that the Haitian Revolution embodies really the fear of a general uprising from the oppressed, of the slaves, and the fear of the fear, of course, from the white population, of course, and the colonial powers too. The fear of a total subversion of the social relations. And the white Creole also feared the end of the French colonization. And what I saw in my documents, in my sources, is that, for example, in 1848, maybe I can focus slightly on what happened, because in 1848, the French government with Schellcher decides to abolish the slavery directly, frankly, the abolition of slavery. But they said, okay, we just need a couple of weeks to write the law. And then you must wait until the law arrives in the Caribbean to be really free. And as you may know, at that time, you need 3 weeks of delay to do the navigation from France to the Caribbean. So the slaves hear about it in March, and then they wait. So they know they will be free. But the first text that arrived said to them, you must wait. You will be free, but not now. Wait a couple of weeks until the law arrives. And from that on, the slaves are more impatient, and they cannot stand the fact that they know they will be free, but they still have to support slavery. And at the end of the month of May, there is an uprising in Martinique, in Saint-Pierre, and the colonial powers decide to abolish slavery without having the legal documents. The texts were arriving, but they were not arrived yet. So it was a sort of anticipation of the abolition. And when that uprising occurred, the white minority said, Haiti is back. The revolution is back. if we are not protected by colonial powers, by colonial authority, it will be the end of French colonization. And if we are all dead, there is no French colonization possible. So, of course, you can see the fear that comes back, the fear of Haiti that comes back in 1848. But even late in the 19th century, the fear of Haiti is still here.
Well, it's just the impact of Haiti and them obtaining their freedom is huge throughout the entire area. So, and I know you talked about this before in terms of the social hierarchies. Would you, if we can just kind of go in a little bit more into the lingering social hierarchies and the cultural perceptions linked to this historical, racial mixing. Do you have any other examples to provide on this?
About the heritage of what's persists in the society?
Yes.
I would say racism, and a specific form of racism that would be colorism.
Yes.
Maybe it's something that you crossed in your life or research. I would say that colorism is a heritage that is very complex and very linked to history, because it's a reference to the fact that light-skinned individuals are better treated and have better opportunity than blacks or dark-skinned people. It is linked with the fact that, of course, for example, slave master preferred to have domestic that would be light-skinned, and the dark-skinned people would be cast in the fields and rejected to the hard works in the field or in the factories, for example. And so it is a way to give more values to mixed-race people rather than to black people who maybe do not seem mixed with white people. So it is a way to give more value to what can be from white origin in a person. And it is something that is very present in every Martinican family, because some individuals, and you can find that in literature, for example, in Joseph Zobel, for example, some individuals claimed that having whitening strategy by marrying light-skinned or even white people. And it is something that I heard in my own family, that we want to have the descendants more light-skinned. And for some people, it was a objective goal. And some people claimed it, but did not do it in reality. So sometimes there is a difference between discourse and reality, but it's something that people said. And in families in Martinique, you had preferences, and I can see that in mine. You can have preferences for the children that is light skin in the contrary of the dark skin one. So I think that's very perverse.
Mm-hmm. No, I would definitely agree on that, in terms of the treatment based on the color of the skin. And this is all going back to this time as to where this is all coming from. And, what would you, for the sources that you've been able to glean all this information, what would you say for anyone researching in this area? What are the valuable sources that they need to look at in terms of, especially with racial mixing in 19th century Martinique?
Of course, I'll start with what I did for my own study. As I said, I chose to study very carefully civil status for my own research. So, as you mentioned at the beginning, the registers of civil status, so birth, marriages, and deaths. But I worked less on that, but it's still very precious, which are notaries' archives. Is that right? The right word?
Yeah.
Notaries? Because it registers all economic and financial transactions. And this is very precious too. And I did not study it, but some historian colleagues told me, for example, that you can see in notaries' archives that you can have donations from white people to colored people in notaries. And of course, if you read letters from that person, if you see civil status, you cannot assume there is intimate link with the colored people. But if you look at notaries' archives, you can find out things that are very surprising. And it existed too. So this is why the relationships between white Creoles and colored people are very, very complex.
Yeah.
And of course, there is literature that can be a very good medium, or press, of course. But notary archives, I think, may give the more accurate and complex vision of all those relationships. There is an American historian who wrote about it, and that I'm really fond of. She's Jennifer Palmer. She wrote a book called Intimate Bonds, and she shows really very clearly how intimate links between this mixed family existed. So she studied Saint-Domingue families in the 18th century, and you can see how a white father, can, in a way, have legitimate family, and in the one hand, give some goods, some estates to natural daughters or natural illegitimate daughters in the same time. So that's why I think notaries' archives are very precious to study racial relationships.
No, definitely. They are very vital to be able to find out and flesh out that information. And with saying that, what are the challenges of interpreting that may arise in interpreting these historical records on race and identity in a colonial context?
The challenge, from what I know, from 1833, for example, there is a law that makes disappear all racial mentions and all discrimination from all official acts, civil status, or notaries. So in theory, it is impossible to recognize a white person from a colored person. However, one can still identify the racial position of a person thanks to the clues I mentioned before, and especially the behavior towards marriage. And to have a close knowledge of social practices and of the family names is essential. So what I tried, and it's a reflex when you work on islands, because you have clues thanks to the family names. So I try to know very well the family names, and it is essential. But as I said, it can be tricky too. So I must really look carefully at all the social practices. And it takes really quite some time. And I hope I managed it well as far as I'm concerned, but it took me really quite some time.
No, it can be very challenging to see all these documents and try to interpret it and what they mean, because you read it, you just see it surface level, and then you're just, okay, let me come back to this document again and reread it and to understand what exactly is being said. Because a lot of these, as you said, these are found in, the archives. These are transactions that are happening. And you're just like, I'm not a lawyer. I'm not here to interpret or to know what that is, but you're forced to, in order to dive deep and get the information that you're trying to glean from what is actually happening on these research. So, Adélaïde, I really do thank you so much for coming on and speaking about this, because this is, from the context especially from French colonial in Martinique. There are some same themes, but again, there are some varying differences as to how things were looked at, were perceived during this time, and to be able to, again, research your family tree and know that you're going to be looking at records that are not necessarily all going to be birth, death, and marriage records. So again, I really do thank you for coming on and speaking to this. I do appreciate your time.
Thank you very much for your invitation. It was an honor for me.
Thank you.
Hoped you enjoyed this episode, and if you did, please make sure to like, follow, subscribe, and write a review for the episode wherever you listen to your podcast. Thank you.